Hello, friends, and welcome to the PrepWell podcast. I'm your host, Phil Black. And if you have an 8th, 9th, or 10th grader with big aspirations, like the Ivy League, or military service academies like West Point, ROTC, or athletic scholarships, boom, you've come to the right place. My specialty, my superpower, if you will, is preparing families for these competitive programs. I'll teach you what your child should do, when they should do it, and how you can help. So stick around and prepare to out-prepare. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the PrepWell podcast. In today's episode, I reflect on a very tumultuous year in college admissions. I should say, another very tumultuous year in college admissions. And even though COVID was less of an issue this year than it was in years past, the damage that's been left in its wake will be felt for many years to come, and will likely be permanent in some cases. So what I'd like to do today is make some observations about what's happening out there, what you can do to manage these changes, and generally what to expect. And this will be based on lessons learned, both good and bad, over the last year or so. And my thoughts will be, to some degree, stream of consciousness. I do have a rough outline of some topics that I'd like to address that seemingly keep coming up over and over and over again, because I think it's important to keep these messages top of mind so that when and if you're ready to take action, you know what you're getting yourself into. Here are a few quick hitters just to get everyone up to speed on what's happening recently. Applications. College applications are out of control. You've probably heard students are applying to 12, 15, 16, sometimes more than 20 colleges. This is insane. And it's not helping anyone. Except the colleges who now get to claim single-digit acceptance rates because they can now reject so many more people. It overwhelms colleges like UCLA, that's getting something like 150, 160,000 applications, which makes it almost impossible for them to give applications a fair shake. How about testing? You've probably heard that many traditional objective measures of achievement, which have been in place for decades, are no longer being offered to students. Or if they are offered, the scores are not even being considered during the evaluation process. First, they canceled SAT subject tests, which some of you don't even know what they are. Then they canceled the essay section of the SAT and ACT. Then they made the SAT and ACT optional. Now they're moving toward a test blind policy, which disallows admissions officers from seeing any standardized test scores, even high ones. We have the UC system, which is the University of California system, the biggest statewide college system. They don't accept letters of recommendation from teachers. So what's left? Grades, class choices, activities, and a few essays? That's about it. Maybe throw in AP scores for another year or two before they get canceled. And then when you hear about rampant grade inflation and pass-fail classes, the de-emphasis on AP scores, what are you left with? Not a lot. I'm sure you can use your imagination to figure out what's left for schools to evaluate and make decisions on when it comes to who to accept and deny. The admissions process no longer favors students who can show on an objective test, given uniformly across the country or the world, that they are top performers. Nobody cares anymore. There are other more important factors, apparently. Let's turn to the cost of college. If you haven't been keeping up, or your children are a little younger, there are basically 3 categories of cost for four-year colleges. The first category is free. If your child goes to a service academy like the Naval Academy or West Point or the Air Force Academy, or they earn generous ROTC scholarships to college, or they're one of the few athletes who receive full athletic scholarships, which are rare. I'm not even going to get into that right now. So that's category 1, free. Category 2, $55,000 a year in-state colleges, if your child happens to live in that state. And cost category number 3, $85,000 a year, private liberal arts colleges. That's it. Those are your 3 choices. 0, $55,000 a year for in-state experience, or $85,000 a year for private liberal arts or out-of-state public schools. And there's very little room in between. And yes, I'm generalizing a little bit for simplicity's sake, but this is generally what a 4-year college education costs nowadays. Do you have that kind of after-tax money for 1, 2, 3, or 4 of your children? And if you don't, how much debt are you and your children willing to take on to make this happen? And if you're not going to a brand name school with name recognition nationally or globally, is it worth it? And it's fine and dandy to claim that there are plenty of lesser known colleges out there with great professors and programs and major choices. I get it. But at $65,000 to $75,000 a year, is going to Eckerd College or Goucher College, nothing against those 2 colleges, but is that going to give you a return on investment for a $70,000, $80,000 a year investment over 4 years? What if it means taking on $100,000 in school debt? These are some things we should think about. Which leads me to the general notion of expectations. Given all of this, is it worth sending your child to a 4-year college at all? Especially if they're not engaged and interested. And even if they are, which may be a stretch, and they've prepared themselves well, what kind of college and at what cost? Whether or not to go to college was never really a question we had to ask before. It was a given, because there were a range of options at different price points that, although never cheap per se, seemed manageable, especially at some of the less popular schools. Today, that's not the case. There are far fewer choices, at least as it relates to 4-year colleges. Now, the community college, the trade school, the military options are a whole different beast, which I'm not going to delve into right now, even though I find them extremely compelling, especially for young men. We'll leave that for a different date. And I know questioning whether college is even worth it anymore seems crazy, because college it's such a societal given. But should it be? Especially if your child and you, possibly, stand to rack up tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt, especially if your child's only choices are to attend expensive but lesser known colleges, especially if they intend to get a degree in a non-commercially viable major, and God forbid, they're going to spend their time playing video games, skipping class, and getting hammered 2 or 3 times a week. That's not a recipe for a good use of $300,000. And so given all of these potential headwinds, the reflexive answer of yes to the need for a 4-year college education should be challenged at a minimum. But social expectations and norms and inertia are powerful forces. Let's talk about majors. I touched on it earlier, but I think it bears its own addressing. Be wary of spending $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year for 4, 5, often 6 years, only to find out that your child majored in gender studies or dance theory or environmental justice. It's happening more and more every year. Colleges are creating these majors out of thin air and at breakneck speed. And mind you, there are plenty of PhDs out there in these subjects who are more than willing to become college professors. What a good gig that would be. Now, if money is no object and spending $300,000 for 4 years is not a big deal, then go for it. Major in hieroglyphics. But if you're leaving school with tens of thousands of dollars in student debt, if not more, please consider your major carefully. Okay, what else? Competitiveness. if your child wants to be competitive in admissions at the more selective colleges, that's a big if. And I don't want to gloss over that, because not every student wants to compete at the high levels. If they do, the process needs to start earlier and be more intentional than ever before. And I know that's tough to hear, and it may sound scary and high pressure. It's just the truth. I'm not suggesting that it's fair or healthy or even worth it. It's just the reality. And parents who listen to podcasts like this and get it and have kids with high potential sometimes find themselves between a rock and a hard place. Because by ninth grade, when some level of engagement should start, parents aren't quite sure whether their child has the ambition, or the goods for that matter, to want to go to some of these more selective colleges. A list which, by the way, grows bigger and bigger every year. And if they ask their children, the kids often don't know. They're 16 years old. Some of them do, many of them do. They're motivated, they're mature, they have their eyes on the prize, and I work with a lot of them, and it's great. But I wouldn't say they're in the majority. Most students in 9th and 10th grade have no interest in thinking about these issues, let alone acting on them. They're more interested in sitting on their bed and swiping on their phones for hours at a time. These students with high potential, but are a little bit slower on the uptake, they need guidance. Anyone who has a shred of ambition needs to find someone like me, or a program like PrepWell Academy, or both, to show them the light, to raise their awareness about what's happening around them early on, or they're going to have very little chance. They can't wake up from swiping on their phone on their bed in 11th grade and all of a sudden want to make this monumental move. It's not going to happen. And I know statistically, many people talk about how something like 75% of all colleges admit at least 70% of all applicants. That's well and good, but those schools don't represent the schools that most students dream about or that most employers recruit from. It's not that they're bad schools and only brand name schools are good, but are the lesser known schools that admit 50% of the applicants worth $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year that you'll be paying? Again, I'm not saying that students or parents are right in dismissing anything but top 50 schools. It's just what happens. Now let's touch on the idea of predictability. All of what we're talking about here sounds pretty intimidating and financially fraught, and from an admissions point of view, almost random. Is there any way to make the process more predictable, more transparent, more direct? Yes, there is. Becoming a recruited athlete is one of the very few ways that will help you gain some level of predictability about where you might get into when it comes to the more selective colleges. If you're not a recruited athlete, most of the selective schools are becoming lottery schools. And I'm not just talking Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and MIT anymore. Many of the top 20 schools are becoming lottery schools, even for the most accomplished students. Ask some of your friends about their experiences. By lottery school, I mean it's almost like a lottery. Even if you're a super applicant, the chances of getting in are almost impossible to predict. And that's unsettling and has a lot of downstream consequences. And mind you, being a recruited athlete is no panacea. It's not a silver bullet. For one, it's very difficult to be good enough to get the support of a coach as a recruited athlete. And two, it becomes a very high stakes game. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're an athlete and you spend 80% of your time focused on your sport, which you typically need to do to get the attention of these college coaches, what happens if it doesn't work out? You don't really have much left on your resume to speak of. You know, my son is a good example of these extremes. He's a talented water polo player. He's being heavily recruited. And by now, at the end of his junior year, he's narrowed down his choices to Harvard, Stanford, and the Naval Academy. Those are pretty high-quality choices. But what happens if he gets injured? What happens if he decides he doesn't want to play water polo in college? What happens if the coach that's recruiting him gets fired and the new coach offers his spot to someone else? Who knows? He's only in 11th grade. There's still a lot of time for things to happen. Obviously, we hope that none of these things happen. But as a thought experiment, it gets pretty scary. If something like this were to happen to my son, he would be going to community college upon graduation. Period. End of story. Because there's nothing really in between the two extremes for him. Because his application wouldn't be remotely competitive with non-athlete applications. He hasn't done internships. He hasn't done outside research projects. He's not the president of the debate team. He hasn't done mock trial. He hasn't done much outside of his sport. His head's been pushed underwater for the last 3 years. So if sports doesn't quote unquote work out, he'll be going to a local community college. What choice does he have? Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it just demonstrates the fragility of the situation. Harvard, Stanford, the U.S. Naval Academy, or XYZ Community College. Those are wildly different outcomes. And by the way, his situation represents the best case scenario, where you actually become a highly recruited athlete. What happens if you get to your junior year and your phone's not ringing, and you're not a recruited athlete, or you burn out, or you don't live up to your expectations, or your potential, or you get injured? Then what do? These are the things that students and parents and families and advisors like me need to think about and talk about early in the game and make informed decisions about. So what do? You do the best you can. Over the course of their high school career, you help your child acquire the skills that they need to adapt to whatever happens. You inoculate them from the insanity of the admissions process. You give them the ability to shift from Stanford to Mesa Community College without skipping a beat. Students must build an enormous amount of resiliency into their mindset these days because there are no guarantees. Predictability is at all-time lows. And that's what PrepWell Academy is set up to do. Yes, the program attracts a lot of go-getters, a lot of engaged parents, students who want to succeed, starting in 9th and 10th grade. I provide the steps and the lessons and the milestones that will help them maximize their potential. Because in the end, it's the study skills, the accountability, the project planning skills, the essay writing, the self-reflection time, time management, the ability to make relationships with adults, understanding your strengths and weaknesses, how to follow up with people, how to anticipate problems in advance. They will learn all of these skills in PrepWell Academy over the course of the next 4 years. And if they engage with the lessons and go through the paces and learn the habits of successful people, then it takes the edge off of the importance of where they eventually go to college. It won't be such a monumental moment for them. So if they make it through the gauntlet and achieve their dream school, awesome. But if they don't, their world doesn't come crashing down because they've learned the skills and the mindset to succeed no matter the school or the job or the program. So if you're not a PrepWeller yet and you're a rising freshman or sophomore, please join us on this journey. In fact, since we just passed June 1st, a couple days ago, the new PrepWell Academy school year has begun. We start on June 1st because we want to use the summer months to our advantage, to make sure students stay engaged, they do productive things, and they ready their brains for the next school year. If you have a graduating 8th grader who will be entering high school next year as a freshman, class of 2026, Or if you have a freshman who's about to graduate and become a sophomore next year, class of 2025, registration is now open. We would love to see you in the program, where you will learn about all of this stuff 1 week at a time. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the continued support. If you know a parent with a 6th, 7th, 8th grader, 9th grader, 10th grader, 11th grader, or even a senior that might find this helpful, please share the episode with them. You can do that by finding the small box with the tiny arrow pointing up. That's the share button. Click that button. Text your friends the link to this episode with a little personal note from you, recommending that they give it a listen. Of course, if you have questions, comments, or an idea for an upcoming episode, I'm all ears. Please reach out to me by email, DM me on Instagram, check out our blog, Facebook, connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you. Until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by PrepWell Academy. PrepWell Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to PrepWellAcademy.com and enroll your child today.